Okay, I wanted to just check in quickly. Thank you to everybody who's arrived early and on time. We are going to get started in a moment. You may have seen in the chat feature, I've put some information in there as a quick programming note. Just to clarify, this call is for reporters and for press. So we're going to be prioritizing their questions. And for anyone else who might be on who isn't a reporter, you are more than welcome to join Common Cause's weekly town hall meetings. And I've also dropped a link to the website where you can sign up for those. Right now, we really need to prioritize questions from the press. So for press, we will be taking your questions at the end. Please feel free at any time to drop them in the chat. And we will then, once we're at the end and Susan opens things up, we'll get to them in the order that you place them, and I'll just prompt you directly to ask your question out loud. I'm Alexis, I'm moderating. So with that said, I am going to turn things over to Susan.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining this press call. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm Executive Director of Common Cause New York. You're going to hear from me, from State Senator Alessandra Biaggi, Douglas A. Kellner, New York State Board of Elections Co-Chair, and Dustin Czarny, Onondaga County Democratic Elections Commissioner, as well as from Assembly Member Yuh-line Niou. There's a growing national and local discussion about expanding and initiating, excuse me, vote-by-mail programs across the U.S. in response to the very real public health risks posed by COVID-19. We'd love to be able to move to a vote-by-mail system in New York, but there are obstacles to a wholesale transition. An expansion of absentee voting would have many of the benefits of vote-by-mail and is a reasonable stopgap measure. Common Cause New York has already recommended consolidating the April 28th presidential primary with our existing June 23rd legislative and congressional primaries, as well as making it easier to request an absentee ballot. You can read our full position and report called Democracy Doesn't Pause on our website. I'm pleased to be joined by Douglas Kellner, who is the co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections. Doug?
Thank you, Susan. So I simply want to add my support for defining that under the current coronavirus public emergency, that it is appropriate to allow all voters to choose to vote absentee. And the reason why the legislation is helpful is because the state constitution has a provision that allows absentee voting only in two circumstances. In the event that a person is absent from the county on the day of the election, or is disabled by illness from voting. And we believe that the intent here is to make it clear that the constitutional authorization for absentee voting on account of illness includes this situation where we have a public health emergency because of the spread of coronavirus. And having the legislature add specific legislation to clarify that provision of the election law will remove any doubts, hopefully, that we can use absentee voting for those voters who choose to do that. I should add further that the Board of Elections has been exploring options on how to expand the use of absentee balloting for elections. And it is a challenge to take systems that we currently have in place for overseas and military voters to apply them to all voters. And it's possible that we may be able to do that by November, but it won't be feasible to do it by June.
Thanks, Doug. Very helpful. The legislation that Doug is talking about is S8015A, which is sponsored by Senator Biaggi, who will be joining us shortly on this call. But in the meantime, we'd like to hear from Assembly Member Yuh-line Niou.
Sorry, it's Yuh-line Niou, actually.
Sorry.
No, it's all right.
I should know by now, you would think.
So I actually wanted to be the assembly sponsor to the bill, and we had intended that to happen, but apparently another assembly member had tried to drop it. And as you know, we are having a lot of difficulties with getting bill numbers to our bills. We're not sure why. Well, we know why, but I think that it's really important that we are working on this piece of legislation. I appreciate that Alexis actually sent out the press release that they had just sent out, and also the report, because the report is really important. What Common Cause is working on is really important, because right now, during a crisis like COVID, we should not be making voters choose between their health and their right to vote. Currently, New York has an extremely limited set of reasons why voters can request an absentee, and we believe that that is actually unacceptable, especially during this time, during this pandemic. And that's why, it's so important that we expand absentee voting to any voter who is concerned over the spread of the illness, and the consolidation of the April primary, I know, is a question as well, to June 23rd. That right now is up for debate. Many lawmakers, including a lot of my colleagues, have floated the idea of vote by mail. We have talked about that at length at other times, because of the fact that other states currently, some states are only vote by mail completely. And we think that it would be very good to eventually transition into a program like that, without maintaining alternatives like, but right now, I think that during this crisis, and with the way that people are used to voting here in New York, I think that we can't just transition into a system like that without maintaining a lot of the alternatives, like in-person poll sites, without running the risk of disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of voters who are used to voting a certain way. But I think that but one way to do this is to expand absentee voting, which I think is a critical stopgap measure right now, especially right now when people can't leave their homes, and especially for folks who are immunocompromised, et cetera, who are used to voting a different way. By consolidating the primary and expanding the absentee, we can make sure every voter can participate in our democracy, while also helping to flatten the curve, which is one of the things that we're trying to do right now. And I just wanted to say that I'm really prepared to fight as hard as we need to for this, because it's for our public health. So thank you again for doing this, and for actually bringing all of these policy issues to the fore. And thank you again to Common Cause as well.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. Now we're going to hear from Dustin Czarny, who is the Democratic Election Commissioner for Onondaga and the chair of the Democratic Caucus for the New York State Election Commissioners Association. Dustin.
Thank you, Susan. And again, thank you, Common Cause, for shedding a light on this important issue. Earlier this week, the New York State Elections Commissioner Association took a pretty strong step, in my opinion, to not only come out for consolidating the April and June primary, but also a unanimous amongst all 124 of our elections commissioners recommendation to expand absentee balloting to include a state of emergency for pandemic disease as a reason for having an absentee ballot. Our offices across the state are being flooded with requests right now to get absentee ballots, and the general feeling is that there is no legal way to give that to people who are not actually sick or are willing to check those boxes on the absentee forms. Adding this language to the 8400 of election law is very important. It's going to remove any kind of doubt that this is a valid excuse. And more importantly, as the assembly member has said and others have said, people will not have to choose between being healthy and risking their health and exercising their right to vote. Because even if we are successful in convincing the governor and the legislature to move the election from April to June, there is no reason to believe that this situation won't continue on into June, into that primary, and even into the November general election as well. Adding this provision into the bill will give voters a surety that their ballots will count. And also, I believe that we should, I've sent some language over to Senator Biaggi's office as well. In addition to just adding this into the bill, we should be looking at how the application is processed, allowing people to email their applications in instead of having to have a wet signature, because that would save cost on their end, save cost on the boards of elections end as well, as postage wouldn't have to be used to mail out applications, and it would be allowed for processing quicker. And also looking at the postage, the postmark requirements as well, because many times ballots that we know are delivered to the post office on time are either not postmarked or are postmarked after the midnight deadline, and those ballots aren't counted. So looking at those sections of the law should be either in this bill or another bill would be very helpful as well. And these are bipartisan recommendations from the New York State Elections Commissioner Association. So Republicans and Democrats agree on all of this. And it is something that we really believe needs to happen as quickly as possible for this election. And then when the constitutional amendment is passed next year, hopefully, to move to a no-fault absentee system, then we can look at vote by mail. Because, as the assembly member said, hundreds of thousands of people are inactive on the voter rolls right now. That means we don't have proper addresses for them. So moving to a strict vote by mail system right now today is not feasible. But what is feasible is a permissive absentee structure. So we would love that to be in place. We would love to administer that. And I'm happy to support this legislation.
Thank you, Dustin. And obviously we at Common Cause are delighted to be on the same page with the recommendations from the NYSECA folks. I'm delighted to say we have been joined by Senator Biaggi, who is the sponsor of the legislation that we've been talking about. And so I would like to turn this over to her now.
Thank you so much, Susan, and apologies for getting on a few minutes beyond when we began. Every single call seems to bleed into the next one, and all we do all day long is sit on a conveyor belt of calls. It's like the I Love Lucy episode when she's like trying to put the chocolates inside of the little papers. That's what it feels like right now. So anyway, back on topic. Good afternoon, everyone. I am incredibly grateful for everyone who's on here right now, who's joined, and of course to Common Cause and Susan, to you, all my colleagues in government who are coming together and creating space to make sure that this message is heard loud and clear. I think that every day that we move forward, it becomes clearer and clearer that our state is faced with the daunting reality that the COVID-19 outbreak is spreading through our communities at a much higher rate than we anticipated. And I think that the numbers that we see now are probably very conservative to the realities of what the numbers, in fact, unfortunately are. Rightfully so, our state and our local governments have mandated drastic measures, which I hope everyone is abiding by to stay safe. And it's, of course, at the guidance of health experts. And the main goal always is to slow the speed through social distancing and limits on gathering, especially in public places. Now, to comply with this and these necessary measures, New Yorkers have willingly changed their entire lives and basically all of their behaviors to adapt to this new way of living for the time being. I am moved beyond measure by New Yorkers stepping up, by their commitment to make the sacrifices that they've made every day to ensure that their neighbors are safe. But at this very moment in history, where it feels like everything is out of their control, I will absolutely not tolerate or allow for voters to sacrifice their voice or their right in our democracy when they should not have to. And that's the reason for this bill. So New York is quickly approaching a presidential primary election. It's in April. It's basically April next week. And we have to do everything we can to make sure that every voter, no matter what their age is, can safely cast their ballot in the election and also in the elections in the future, which of course, as we know, the state and federal primaries are in June. Health experts across the country, and trusted health experts, I should say, because there's many health experts saying things that are not trustworthy, have advised individuals with underlying health conditions who are at a greater risk of serious illness from COVID-19 to avoid unnecessary gatherings or events. And so accordingly, any at-risk individuals should be rightfully wary of voting in person at crowded polling places on presidential primary election day. There are many older New Yorkers and those with underlying health conditions in my district, across all the districts in the state, who are at a heightened risk from the virus, and they should not have to choose between safeguarding their health and fulfilling their civic duty. Nor should any New Yorker who is in quarantine be denied their right to participate in election day and on election day. Our current statute provides limited circumstances for eligible voters to request an absentee ballot. Dustin brought up some of the circumstances surrounding that. Some of the examples are being out of the country, being out of the county of residence, or New York City on election day, having an illness, a disability that prevents someone from appearing in person to vote. But these restrictive 6 categories and the criteria that are creating them do not accommodate people who are concerned about the risk of voting in person, or who pose a risk to other people's health, especially during a declared national emergency and a global pandemic. By redefining illness in and on the absentee ballot form, we will be allowing New Yorkers to request an absentee ballot if they are unable to appear personally at their polling place due to a public health concern that voting in person would expose themselves or others to that risk. It is very simple. It is common sense. It is straightforward. Currently, if New Yorkers request an absentee ballot but don't meet the limited qualifications, it is considered a felony crime. Okay, so let's think about that for a moment. We can fix this problem with this bill. When I first introduced the bill, it was really out of a precaution to protect the voting rights of the most vulnerable. Now it's moved to being a moment where it is out of a need of necessity. And so we have to be thinking about all of us, and we have to adapt accordingly so that every New Yorker can safely vote in our elections for the foreseeable future. I really want to also say that if we have our polling sites open, we know, number one in the state of New York, that a majority of voters are over the age of 60 who vote. Those are the most vulnerable at the moment. Also, the poll workers are also oftentimes our aging New Yorker population. There is no reason why we should be putting anybody at risk right now. And so I'm just very grateful that we're gathering here today to continue our advocacy, to protect our democracy, and to stand together to make sure that this bill is not only put into place, but that New Yorkers can vote and vote safely. So thank you so much for doing this. I really look forward to hearing from everyone else who's on this call today.
Thank you so much, Senator. We're very grateful that you've introduced the bill, and I want to thank our other speakers for joining us and everyone else for joining us here today. During uncertain times, democracy doesn't pause. It has to evolve. New York lawmakers can put the health of voters and our election integrity first by first consolidating our presidential primary from April to June and then passing Senator Biaggi's bill that will expand absentee voting. We'll now take questions. Please state your name and outlet. Alexis, do you want me to start with the questions in the chat? Will you take them?
Yeah, so Karen DeWitt has the first question. Karen, please unmute and feel free to ask. We'll then take Andrew Millman's question.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. I know how to work this. I only work in, radio and technology, right? I should know better. So the question that I had was, is there any chance that you expand absentee voting and somebody doesn't like the outcome of a particular election and challenges it in court, saying, well, that's against the Constitution that these people voted by absentee ballot, and it just messes up the election. Is that a concern, and how do you protect against that?
Yes, it is a concern, and that's why we think that Senator Biaggi's bill is a good idea. There are several election commissioners who have already gone on record saying that even under the current statute, we think it's appropriate to approve absentee ballot applications for voters who have only the fear or concern about spreading coronavirus rather than actually suffering from a current illness because of the public health emergency. But having legislation that will clarify that by statute would certainly help to immunize those rulings against any challenges in court later on. And I would remind people that after 9/11, we faced this same question about the constitutionality of absentee balloting for people who were in Lower Manhattan in the 9/11 disaster area. And the legislature passed a law to authorize special voting for residents of the disaster area so that their ballots would count even though they could not go to their assigned polling places after the 9/11 emergency. So there is precedence for this type of legislation.
And if I could just chime in on that as an elections commissioner on the ground, while some commissioners have been able to get this type of agreement amongst them, it would be much better if legislation is passed so we can remove all doubt and be able to count these ballots. And even on the court level, even in the judicial level, the trend has been towards acceptance, especially if there's a statute that is in place that is passed by the legislature before the the election starts taking place. So passing a alteration to 8400 will, I believe, pass judicial muster as well as at the boards of elections.
Okay, Karen, does that answer your question? You can just tell us in the chat if you need more. Okay,
Great, thank you.
thank you. Okay, Andrew Millman, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my question was about DNC rules that mandate presidential primaries have to happen by June 2nd, and the New York state primary is obviously after that. Are any of you concerned about the New York losing delegates as a result? And have you heard any information about this rule being reconsidered?
We haven't. If you're talking about the moving of the election from April to June, we haven't heard any, or at least I haven't heard any noise from the DNC either way about this. I would hope that, Tom Perez is from Buffalo, so I hope that he would, go to bat for us on this, under this unique circumstance. I mean, but given the current state of the crisis that should be ballooning, if we listen to Governor Cuomo's conference today, he said within 21 days. Well, that's right when we're about to start early voting for this next election. So the risk of losing some delegates is far outweighed by the risk to the public of and our election workers of holding this election during this time. So that would be more of a question for the DNC, but I would say it's worth the risk to move it, to lose some delegates.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to take the next question from Amanda Fries at the Times-Union. Amanda, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, everybody. Amanda Fries from the Times-Union. I'm just curious, when exactly would the legislature be able to vote on this legislation?
Hi, so I'm just taking myself off of mute. This is Senator Biaggi. So we are likely to go back to Albany next week. As you know, the budget deadline is approaching. April 1st is when we are constitutionally required to pass a budget. So if we were going to be voting on these measures, it would likely be at that time. However, just like every other legislature across the country, and as well as our federal legislature, Congress, we are looking at ways of making it feasible and seeing whether we can be able to vote remotely. It's obviously a challenge. It's never been done, but nothing is impossible. And so that's a TBD. But with regard to voting on these bills, right now the entire conference is looking at putting together as many pieces of legislation that deal with the coronavirus that are in front of us. And so that's something that we're working on. It's a work in progress, but we'll be back in Albany, I believe, next week. And just as a real quick response to the previous question, it is actually my understanding that there are conversations happening with the DNC and that the DNC would likely be willing to grant a waiver for the delegate penalty. The reason why that's considered a strong supposition is because it would in these times be a very, very bad PR move to deny New York of the right to have delegates during a presidential election season while we are in a pandemic. Now, that is obviously that piece is my personal opinion, of course, but my understanding is there are conversations with the DNC to request a waiver for the delegate penalty.
Okay. I think that's it for questions from reporters.
Alexis, can I have a minute?
Yes, please.
Okay. I do want to point out that the states surrounding us, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, have all found ways to have their legislatures meet and vote remotely. So I hope that that's something which the legislature can take up next week, whatever changes to the both houses rules, whatever technology needs to be set up so that we can have the benefit of all of your good ideas and working for the public continuing on through this crisis. And we at Common Cause joined with our good government colleagues in a statement urging the legislature to stay in session and that government should continue to function in a public way so that the public knows that the crisis is being addressed by not just the executive, but by our individual representatives as well.
I could not agree with you more, Susan.
Thanks.
Okay, so that's it for questions from the press. Although I see, okay, Claudia Irizarry from the city just threw herself into the chat here. Claudia, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question to the group.
Sorry, yeah, thank you so much. I know that I'm kind of jumping in right at the tail end. I just wanted to ask Senator Biaggi if the legislation would apply not just for the presidential and congressional primaries on April 28th, but also the Brooklyn special election scheduled for that exact same date.
Well, the bill is for absentee ballots for all elections. So I would have to take a look at that. I can't imagine how it wouldn't apply for that.
It would apply.
It would
There we
apply.
go.
It
Yeah,
would
I couldn't imagine that it wouldn't apply. So there we go. And it would.
Okay.
Okay, so I think, if there, Andrew, you and I are going to communicate offline. Any other reporters or members of the press who want to ask a question? Susan is going to have to go in a minute, but that doesn't mean others, I think, can't stick around. So last call for reporters to drop a question in the chat so we can call on you. Going to give you a second to just.
Alexis, let me throw out one little tidbit that
Please.
is a little bit relevant, is that almost everybody who has spoken publicly on the issue has called for postponing the primary to April 28th. The New York City Board of Elections and the State Board of Elections have both made requests to the governor to issue an executive order to that effect. And so there are a lot of people saying, well, how come that hasn't happened yet? And one of the reasons is that the authority for the governor to issue executive orders is only for 30 days at a time. So that some people speculate, even though the governor hasn't formally announced it, that it'll be March 30th that the governor issues a formal decision to postpone the primary. But the State Board of Elections, both the senior staff and the 3 commissioners have given informal advice to the counties that they should work off the assumption that the primary is going to be postponed. And we have advised counties not to spend money or to incur further health risks proceeding with the April 28th primary. So even though the governor hasn't formally issued an executive order postponing it, for practical purposes, we're advising county boards to act on that basis. And of course, if the governor decides to go ahead with the April 28th primary, which we doubt, then everybody will have to scramble to make it happen. But I thought that the press would be interested in knowing that behind the scenes, that is the informal advice that's going on so far.
Great, that's really helpful.
Yeah,
Okay.
and just to piggyback on that, that's what many commissioners are doing on the ground. Some of them have already spent money. There's mail check cards going out over the next couple of days that vendors have already put into the mail, so we can't get that back. But one of the reasons why we are making this big push to move it is for the health and safety of our election workers, who tend to be older, who tend to be in the at-risk categories. They are already telling us they do not want to work. So we're going to face a massive shortage, whether it's in April or June, but definitely in April. And, a story just broke yesterday that poll workers in Florida that worked the election were tested positive for COVID-19, and they believe it was because of their work. I mean, it's hard to tell where somebody gets this horrible disease, but that is the type of concern that is raging through the election worker community right now.
Okay, thank you, Dustin and Doug. Other questions from press, or have we maxed out here? Okay, I think that was thorough. Thank you so much to our guests who were able to join. I'm sorry, Susan had to jump on another one of these kind of calls, and we will be keeping everyone updated and posted as we continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.